Hey, let's talk about context engines. We're coming in hot off of a Heaven's Vault Let's Play, so I'd like to talk about the primitive context engine in that game, and about some more advanced algorithms we might use to create them in the future. I'm also going to have to talk about what they are. What's a context engine? A context engine is a way to generate narrative for your video game. It's different from other methods of generating narrative because it doesn't actually generate any content. It just arranges the content you already have. So you have to write everything, but it will put the correct beats in front of the player depending on what the player does. This might sound fairly simple, but it is a lot more interesting than it sounds. It's got a lot more ramifications than you might expect. Let's talk about how Heaven's Vault uses it. You've got a robot, and the robot can say anything it wants. It can talk about how old this artifact is, or how it doesn't like a specific person, or how it doesn't like what you've done with your old robots, or how it doesn't like your boat, or how it doesn't like whatever it doesn't like today. All of these dialogue bits have preconditions, things that must happen before they can happen. You can't talk about an artifact until you've got the artifact. You can't talk about a person until you've met the person. You can't talk about what happened to your previous robots until you've mentioned that you had some. This is a simple way to set this up, right? On the back end, what happens is we've got a whole bunch of dialogue snippets in a giant bucket, in a big pool. And each of these dialogue snippets keeps track of its own preconditions. And the game engine just looks through this giant stack of things for anything that might be worth playing this moment based on whatever's happening in the game. It's a giant pool that fires off, not at random, but it fires off irregularly, which is why Heaven's Vault feels so floaty. It doesn't feel like there is a driving linear story, because all the story beats are just in a giant pile. What makes this weak is that it's only accidentally a context engine, because they forgot to actually put the context in the context engine. What do I mean? Well, lots of these happen in sequence. Like, you find a specific artifact, you go to someone and they tell you about the artifact, you decide what you want to do with the artifact, and then you feel the fallout of whatever you've done, and maybe they branch. Maybe there's alternate takes. This is a context. It's a bunch of events that are arranged in some sort of order. It's also very similar to how you would write a linear story, right? This is basically a linear story just thrown in a bucket. The big difference between a linear story and a context engine-driven system is that these stories are not dominant in the player's experience. Let me go ahead and explain that, okay? Some mild spoilers for Mass Effect. You're playing Mass Effect and you go down to a moon, and this is the Rachni moon. It's covered in giant spider things, and there are some scouts down there, some scouts from Rex's species. That is something where you're going to have to go down there. You have to rescue them or not rescue them. You're going to have to kill the Rachni or not kill the Rachni. In terms of how that's written in actual Mass Effect, there is simply a set of forks. Do you save the scouts, or do you save the biological data and let them die? Do you save the Rachni, or do you let the Rachni die? These are the sorts of events you'll see all throughout the game, right? This is what's called a standard branching linear narrative. The problem is that you're going to want to see the after effects of this later on. So this gets very expensive, because not only do you have to write a bunch of different branches, but you've got to keep writing a bunch of different branches. You've got to take that forward into the future and be like, okay, well, now the Rachni came back. You get to see the after effects of what you chose to do. And it never works. It never works emotionally. You can bring the Rachni back, but by the time you get there, there has been a giant gap where you haven't been thinking about things like that at all. And then the Rachni show up and you're like, oh, okay. It doesn't have the emotional connection that you're going to want, the emotional punch you're going to want. To the dev, the choice is the part that matters. Are you the sort of person that saves lives, or are you the sort of person who goes for the greater good even if it costs lives? Are you xenophobic or not? What sort of person are you? Those are the questions that the dev wants to ask. The questions the player wants to ask are, what happens next? What happened? What happened after my choice? Keep telling me a story. Unfortunately, the structure of this story doesn't really allow for the player's question to get answered. All it allows is for the devs to desperately struggle to find excuses to cram random things into the story to show that your choices, they did matter. Look, here's a picture of Arachni. You get 7+ preparation points because you saved Arachni. Isn't that important to you? It's like, no, it's not important. You suck. Except they don't suck. They're actually quite good. The problem is the story structure sucks. How does this work in a context engine? Well, when you cruise on down to the planet, you are going to have this sequence where you are trying to find the scouts and save them. And then you get to choose, do you save the scouts and lose all that medical information that would have saved their species? Maybe they have a problem. Their species has a plague that doesn't allow them to procreate. And so, these people, you saved them, but now you're further away from the solution that you might have wanted in order to save their species as a whole. Is that worth it? Alternately, you can let them die and take the data. Is that worth it? So how is this different from the forking branch that we saw earlier? Well, the difference is that we can just keep writing. You saved these scouts. Well, here's the branch where one of the surviving scouts says that they're going to become a scientist because they remember a little bit of the data that you lost, and they think maybe they can do something with it. And then 2 weeks later, here's a scout that betrayed the species, the entirety of civilized space, and decided to join up with the Reapers. And then after that, some amount of time after that, here's an event where half of the scouts have joined the Reapers and half of the scouts haven't joined the Reapers and are fighting, and you get to step in. Because this is only loosely bound to the core story of the game, you can write all of this right up front. You don't have to try and figure out how to work it into the rest of the game, aside from the game's core beats. Like, obviously, if you defeat the Reapers, then this stuff can't happen because the Reapers are defeated. But as long as the basic flow of the story lines up, these can happen whenever you want. You visit the giant space station. Well, guess what? These guys pop into existence, and then they explain to you that they're going to be scientists. You visit some random moon somewhere. These guys pop up, and you get attacked by new fighters that are working for the bad guys. And you're like, oh, why is this happening? And then you find out, and it's like, oh, these cursed people I saved. So there's a through line. When you save these people, you make the choice to choose the potential of human life over the potential, or not human life, the potential of life over the potential of science, right? You're trying to save the few, damn the consequences, and that's a fine choice, but you have to feel it. You have to feel that resonate basically forever, and that's what this does. It's a steady trickle of that theme, of that emotional beat. It plays moment after moment after moment throughout the entirety of the game, and that will allow you to really get that sense that you actually did do something. These are the fallout. This is the fallout of the things you did, the choices you made, and it's loosely bound. So we don't have to worry about what else the player has done. Even if they've sided with the villains, these events can all still play. The only thing that actually changes is whether or not you're fighting on one side or the other down here. That is really freeing if we have the architecture that allows us to write these kinds of stories. Hell, we could even have them happen in different games. We could be like, oh, did you not finish this sequence last time because of how you were exploring? That's fine, we'll put it in the next game. No biggie. That is an amazing amount of freedom, and it doesn't require you to remember what happened. It doesn't require you to go back and see if there's any opportunity to put something in. It creates an emotional and thematic through line through the entire course of the game. Great. You let them die, though. We chose to save the science. What does that mean? Well, obviously there are going to be some events, just like the others. Here you find someone is like, oh, you let my uncle die. And then here there's someone like, my uncle definitely would have wanted to die in order to save the species. And then the scientist is like, oh, look at all this stuff we can do. I think we can save I think we can do some real good here. And then down here you visit their a graveyard accidentally. The graveyard spawns in while you're wandering around somewhere. All of these things are pretty simple setups, right? But you can also just say, hey, and you also gain +1 biological point. And when you get 10 biological points, the next step in that species saving system will play. The context where you try and free them of their plague. Once you're at 10, play this. And now here's the key. This through line, this emotional through line, where you sacrificed in order to save the species, that has the same emotional and thematic resonance as all of these. Anything that involves trying to save that species has that same emotional nugget, or people die, or people don't help, or people fail, and you're desperately struggling to find some way through the mess. That is the core of that theme. So we know that this emotional stake can continue by simply passing it off to a larger construct, a larger context that has the same emotional core. And in that way, we continue with our emotional and thematic through line. So we do get some beats here, but we get the same emotional through line over here. This is a method to plug things in. So you can either go through their entire story, just a context that plays throughout the entire game, piece by piece, or you can bind it to a larger context. But there are other ways to bind these, and that's important because how you tell the story, you can't simply have all the stories disconnected from each other. That's kind of dumb. So in this case, when you land on the moon and you're trying to save the people, once you actually reach them, well, dun, 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 the Rachni show up. Giant spiders try and eat your face, and you fight through that. These events are tied together. They're not the same context, but they happen in the same place at the same time. And you choose whether the Rachni live or die. And as before, maybe you can keep writing that. If you let the Rachni live, maybe you discover Rachni hiding on some faraway world. Or maybe you discover Rachni-inspired music making an appearance in popular culture. Over here, they're dead. Well, you discover crystals that contain their songs, and you learn how to play them. And you discover their corpses over on this moon over here, or whatever, right? And let's go ahead and bind them back into the game. At the beginning of Mass Effect 3, there's a hallucinatory sequence where there is a baby boy, a kid, like a 7-year-old, accompanying you randomly. And it doesn't ever really pay out. It was supposed to pay out, but it didn't really work. What if that was the Rachni? If you saved the Rachni, then when humanity is being exterminated, you see them, you hear their songs, you get their emotional connection, and you are supported by their existence. And if you let them die, well, then you see humanity die with the exact same imagery, and maybe you see phantoms of the Rachni. How far you can push this depends on how many of these events you had, because when you start to use aggressive things like the player hallucinating Rachni, you've got to make sure the player understands that's happening because you are really affected by the fact that you committed genocide. And so your brain is falling apart. Your mind can't handle the stress of the fact that you killed off an entire species. So you're hallucinating Rachni when it comes your time to be exterminated. If you didn't use the Rachni enough for that, then you'd have to take a lighter touch. But that's the point. Storytelling is all about making sure that these stories line up. And the point here is that we can make them line up using a context engine. We do not have to manually seed the Rachni into 100 different events over the course of the game. You can just write Rachni blurbs, and the game will slot them in at the right time. The question is, how does the game slot them in at the right time? Well, each of these has preconditions, things that must be true. So in order for us to learn that someone has become a doctor, there's the precondition of you must be in a civilized space, whether that's the main space station or some secondary space station. You must be somewhere where a scientist can spawn in and have a conversation with you, and things won't be exploding. Down here, it must happen on an isolated moon where you can be attacked by mercenaries and you can spawn in people in spacesuits and space tanks. These preconditions are intended to fire as the player explores the universe. So as the player explores, we can fire these up when they happen to be in the right place at the right time. This is a very valuable way to think about things, because what we've done is we've done the same thing as Heaven's Vault. We've just given preconditions to these blocks of these scenes, and as the player explores, they will uncover things that are related to wherever they happen to be. If you've got a player that prefers to be out among the dunes of faraway planets and doesn't like talking to people, then you're going to get some of these firing more than others. And similarly, if you've got someone who really likes hanging around the densely populated urban areas, some of these are going to fire more than others. And this is where things get a little complicated, because you've got to start thinking about what sort of preconditions exist and what that means. So let's go ahead and give you, this is the reason why making this kind of game is different than writing a normal story. Let's go ahead and give you an example. Same example, right? Same universe. We've got Tali. Tali is, in her spacesuit, being Space Tali. And she's got a fair number of contexts. She's got like a context where she talks about her homeworld. She's got a context where she talks about her biology and how she feels. She's got a context where she falls in love with you. She's got a context where she, goes and tracks down things for her fleet. But she's also got a context where she learns about the Geth. Because the Geth kind of kicked her species off their homeworld. And they're back, the Geth. So this is a situation where there's a lot of stuff happening, and she has to be able to unfold this context. As the player explores, they'll uncover most of these elements on their own based on just how they're exploring the game. You go to a distant moon, you discover some damaged Geth, she hacks it. It's a moment of opportunity that plays the next bit of the context. But you also have a buddy, another companion, who is the Legion, who is the Geth. And the Geth are, not evil, they're just screwed up, right? And he's got his own contexts. And he also has contexts where you learn what the Geth are and all that stuff. And space jammy stuff happens. And you know what? In the end, you have to decide whether to kill the Geth or save the Geth. And these two things have to happen at the same time. In order for either of these contexts to matter at all, there is an emotional beat at the end where Tali goes, "You must kill the Geth, they're going to destroy my people." Otherwise, both of these contexts fall flat. But what if the player has been exploring one more than the other? What if the player has been kind of just tagging along with Legion, because Legion's kind of cool, right? And they're about to trigger this final sequence. But Tali is still way up there because you haven't been hanging out with her this time. The context engine's main responsibility is not serving up whatever context happens to match what the player is doing. It's figuring out how to serve up contexts that the player doesn't yet care about. Because in order to play this context, we need to play these contexts. We have to fill these in before we can move forward. And that is something that the game has to understand. One way to do that would be to just remove this connection. You can't go any further until you've gotten to this part. That's not ideal, though, because who knows how long it'll be before the player turns their attention back to Tali. During that time, Legion hasn't had anything to say. So suddenly you're moving forward with Tali, and then suddenly Legion comes back in. Maybe that's not so bad because these are fundamentally connected, right? But there is a better way to handle this. And that's simple. The game keeps track of how close you are to this kind of cement bridge, this kind of absolutely required bridge. And it makes sure that if one of the contexts is getting too far along, it pushes for the other context. Let's give you an example. These here. Talia has to learn about what the Geth actually are. She knows all the storybooks from, her kid, as a kid rather, and she knows, how to hack them and stuff. But what actually are they? In order to learn that, Tali has to go back to the fleet, her home fleet, the Armada. She has to go back, so there is a constraint of at the Armada. Now, if the player stumbles into the Armada, this can play. But if the player doesn't stumble into this armada, you have to find a way to make them go to the armada so this event can happen. One way to do that is to just have an enabler. So there is like some context where the armada is now available. Maybe Tali says, hey, we should go back to the armada. No other explanation. Maybe the armada shows up because it needs to do life support. So wherever you happen to be, the armada just warps in and does life support. But the armada is a theme. It's a seed, and these constraints, they're fulfilled by the seed of having the armada around, but the armada itself is a seed that can grow and bloom and has stories and themes. The idea is that the armada is the core of this whole conversation about what it's like to be a lost people, what it's like to have no home, no money, nothing to rely on except the rest, both the other people in your species. You haven't got any buddies. Everybody hates you except for your friends, and you can't go out there. You can't mingle with them. You literally can't. If you try, you will get killed by their germs or by their guns. This is a heavy, heavy theme. And to just plonk the armada down into a setting and be like, oh, it's here now, it doesn't really call that theme up. Fortunately, because we know that the armada is a heavy theme, we know that any sequence where the armada is involved will have the same themes. They'll be thematically compatible. So here's an armada sequence where Tali has to go back to her armada because her father got in trouble for accidentally unleashing a Geth, and it destroyed a ship. So she hears about this over the shortwave, and it's like, oh, I've got to go back to the armada player because my uncle's in trouble or my father's in trouble, whatever it is. And then once that's done playing, well, boom, you're at the armada, and there's the seed. So now both of these sequences are playing. They're not playing at the same time, but they're both available in local space, and the expectation is that you're going to do both of them because they're both like right there. We spawn in all of the things that are required for both of them, and we just allow the player to let them unfold whichever way they want. They're not allowed to leave before completing this sequence because it's a core sequence. But if they wanted to, they could leave Tali's father floating in deep space. Whatever. That's not a core sequence, so they can leave before this one's complete. But they can't leave before this one's complete, just because of the nature of the game. This is the core of how the context engine tries to sync up its contexts. It looks for constraints and seeds. When the player goes someplace and it's about to spawn in some kind of sequence of events, it chooses what sequence of events based on what seeds it needs to power forward unpopular contexts. So let's say that you haven't done anything with Tali yet, and we're back here, right? We need to do these things with Tali, and we haven't done any of them yet. And we know that there is a context that needs the fleet. Well, we could spawn in the fleet directly, but it's far gentler and more efficient if we can find something that grows out of the player's own activities. So if the player goes and visits the markets on the main space station in that game, maybe then we're thinking, okay, well, what sort of event are we going to spawn in for the markets? Because we're gonna want to spawn in some contexts to make this interesting. We have a couple of options. We can be like, well, there's the context where someone complains that they need a rebate or return a good, and here's one where there's like villains trying to extort people. And then here's the one where the player can say, this is my favorite shop on the Citadel. And then, here's one where the Tali species has decided that they're going to buy in bulk from one of these vendors, which happens to have another chain that requires you to go to the fleet, or brings the fleet here. Something that spawns in the seed of the fleet. We are waiting on the fleet seed for this setup over here. So when we see that we have these options for what event to spawn in next, we simply choose the one that gives us the seed we need. And that is the heart of how a simple context engine can work. When you have a bunch of options, simply choose the option that takes you towards being synchronized. Choose the option that reduces the amount of drift. This is very, very basic. It doesn't require any real effort, and it's compatible with simply erasing this line until Tali's caught up. So using this approach, you don't have to even learn how to spawn in things by force. You can simply make sure that there are a variety of options available for every seed in every common situation. You're out on a moon somewhere, buggying around, trying to figure stuff out. Well, guess what? There is a bunch of Tali's folk just kind of hanging out in some ruins over here trying to scavenge goods. Same exact process. You could spawn in anything on this dusty old moon, but you need to get Tali's stuff moving. So you spawn in something that's related to Tali. You spawn in stuff that has a seed related to her future requirements. This works when your seeds are thematic and limited. So you don't have seeds for everything under the sun. It's not like you must have person A and this artifact and this thing and this thing and this thing. That's no longer required. A lot of the constraints in Heaven's Vault have a ton of constraints. It's like, this piece of dialogue only happens if you found this artifact, sold it to this person, translated this much text, are at this moon, and have this kind of relationship with this other person, and have this specific variant of the robot. It's like, okay, you can do that, but that's contexts. The majority of that heavy lifting is done by writing things in order. If you need to have stuff happen before other stuff, just have it happen before other stuff. Just write it as a sequence. It's when you need to connect to the rest of the universe that you need to have those seeds. And so you should keep those seeds as simple, fundamental elements of your story. Things like the Citadel. Things like that armada or that species. Not things like a particular person. The reason that that's important is because otherwise you end up with a situation where you're trying to backfill hundreds and hundreds of possible events. Let me give you an example. I wrote a game recently. I'm thinking about the best way to do this, but basically I wanted to write a Star Trek-like. So I was building up, how do I build like Star Trek stories, where you got the A plot and the B plot, and they kind of just weave around each other and then they resolve. I wanted to do that generatively. So what I decided is I would use a context engine, but this is before I had done any real thinking on the matter. So I just kind of slapped it together. And the concept is that you have a bunch of ships in your fleet, and they do just general jobs. So if you've got a passenger liner, then it does passenger liner jobs in the background, and you just get a steady cash flow from that. But sometimes that goes awry, and something complicated happens, and that's when you actually play that out with the people that are on the spaceship doing that thing. The way that works is that there is a core context, which is whatever the complicated mission is, the core mission that was complicated. So if you're a passenger liner, it's like, well, you go pick up people, and then you go into space to drop them off, and then there is an SOS, and then you go on to the next place, and so on and so forth. And then there's also a complication, which would be like, oh, there's a spy trying to get aboard, and then, the spy does spy stuff, and then if you didn't detect them in time, then such and such happens, and you get in trouble with humans for letting a spy aboard, whatever, right? But the problem is that there are so many loose ends here that it became a nightmare to try and get these things to backfill correctly, because this event and this event have to happen at the same time in order for this system to feel right. You have to have the resolution of you dropping off the people you've saved from the red alert and the spy that you may or may not have caught. Those have to come out at the same time, or else the episode won't have a crescendo. It won't spike. It'll just kind of taper off. So in order to do that, we have to backfill at a specific rate. And it's like, well, and this one has a requirement of, must have a person. This one is must have a person, and it must be the same person as that one. And so then you've got like this one must have also be at a space station. This one must be on a planet. This one must be, oh, we need a person, but it's a different person than the one down below. And then this person is the same person as the one down below. And then over here we've got a whole bunch of constraints, that are like, oh, this must happen, then this must happen, and what's down here, do this thing. And it's like, okay, got to introduce more context so we can feed into these things. And then we got to get those contexts, and they may have a chain. And then this one has a requirement where we must have another context. And it's like, oh my gosh. So then we got another one, and then down here it pays out the same context as this, and we need it over here. So that means this has got to happen between this and that. And you can see how it's like really, really messy. You've got to work out exactly when which seeds and which constraints fire. You've got to like set up this thing where it's like, okay, well, we got 2 scenes from this, and then we will cut the scenes, even though they're written in order. There needs to be a buffer, and then we can return back to those scenes because we need to play out all of this sequence in order to get the constraint that this scene actually needs. And then we've got to cut these sequences because now we're playing this sequence, and then we got to play them at the same time some more. And it's like, ooh, this is getting complicated. And more importantly, the pacing is very bad. It's being dictated very artificially. Nothing is flowing at a rate that feels like an emotional story. Instead, it just is flowing at whatever rate is dictated by the constraints and the seeds. But if you write your game to have very, very few constraints and seeds of this sort, then you don't have to worry about this. It's never going to be overbearing. If you're playing multiple contexts, you're playing multiple contexts that aren't tightly bound, so the player can advance one or the other as they see fit. You're not going to have to worry about whether or not they're properly syncing up, because who cares if they're properly syncing up? They're not tightly related. The only context, the only constraint that's required is, that they're both on the Citadel. And that's such a common constraint that you can spawn that in however you want. The player will accidentally spawn it in all the time. If you're trying to do this kind of event, it makes more sense to use a different generative technique, one that can actually do some planning and be like, okay, well, then we'll make this character do these things, rather than saying, well, there's a context that needs character and it repeats twice, so we'll use this character. It makes more sense for it to be generative because when you're generating content, you can avoid this kind of backfill complexity, and you can try to generate content in a way that is paced naturally. Of course, that's an entirely different challenge, but it's possible. It's certainly easier than backfilling and trying to keep it all working properly, which is something I've been trying to do for 2 weeks now, and I've come up with a couple of solutions, and they're all awful. So this is the sort of thing I'm thinking about when I talk about context engines. I'm talking about these simple elements that almost self-organize. As long as your constraints and your seeds are largely about whether or not things have to be synced up, and a couple of core things like whether or not you're on a space station. Those are the sorts of things that the context engine can play fast and loose, and it can drive the context chains that are supposed to happen next. It can drive those by simply preferring what kind of contexts to fire. That's really powerful, and it's really subtle, and it works. Pretty sure it works pretty well. This is fundamentally different from the way Heaven's Vault does it, because Heaven's Vault has no driving factor. All of the things that drive Heaven's Vault are hard-coded. You go to this moon, you find this thing, now this moon unlocks. There's some interesting things going on there, which we can talk about later, but it doesn't actually do things like you must go to this next moon, because we have to sync up the concept of the Sky Goddess ship crashing along with the rebuilding of the Sky Goddess ship. Those never end up having to sync up because the game doesn't understand how to drive them. So you find out a fragment of one story, and then you never hear about that story again. And then at the very end, suddenly that story comes back, but you only heard it halfway the first time, and suddenly there's a massive disconnect. You're like, what's going on? That's why you have to configure it like this. You have to configure it so that the context engine can line those contexts up, so you can make sure that your story unrolls in a way that makes emotional and narrative sense. I hope this was coherent. I took a lot of takes. My voice is actually going, but I think that this is what I wanted to say about the basics of a context engine. Let me know what your opinions are down below, and keep in mind that I'll be building at least one, probably two, context engines, hopefully this year.